I'm Philip Ishola, I'm the CEO for Love 146 UK. We're an organisation that provides care and support to trafficked children, children unaccompanied and separated, and on the move across Europe, and indeed we work in other parts of the world, specifically working with these vulnerable groups. Part of our initiative to support the Permanent People's Tribunal and to create an indictment of individual states or groups of states within a union to look at how and why the conflict between border protection, legislative frameworks, asylum systems that are developed, and that of the children's conventions, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and also the various conventions in regard to trafficking, and in particular the Human Rights Act and indeed Human Rights Convention. And I say a conflict because there is a conflict between the two, and this dichotomy is explicit in how children are seen and treated, and this conflict has hugely detrimental impacts on the lives of children in a whole range of areas, including health. And when we talk about health, I specifically refer to the trauma that children have experienced, and indeed I would go as far as to say traumatising these children further in regard to how they are treated, seen as children, and indeed as young people up to the age of 18 and young adults post 18. Conflicts undermine the humanitarian conventions and indeed undermine state child protective legislation and mechanisms designed to protect all children that are within a member state's area of responsibility, or indeed within the area of responsibility of a union of member states, such as the European Union and the Council of Europe in that regard. And these children, who are inherently vulnerable within these migration routes, and in particular these trafficked children that are hidden further within these migration routes, and indeed in other routes that are employed by human traffickers and child traffickers in particular, are clear. They are vulnerable, and the responsibility that is incumbent on the state or group of states is also clear, as defined within the conventions, the multiple conventions, from Lanzarote to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and indeed the Human Trafficking Conventions. But it becomes clear when engaging with these children that their best interests, their rights, the duties that are incumbent on states are compromised. The conflict between immigration, border protection and asylum legislation and child protection conventions is clear, and the impact even more so in terms of how children are treated and their experience, which we see within the media and from personal stories and reports of children and their treatment across Europe within the migration route that they are sometimes forced to undertake, and indeed within the reception arrangements of multiple states across Europe, including the United Kingdom. A question arises: is that compromise intentional or unintentional? We pose it is intentional and designed through the immigration, asylum, border protection mechanisms to prioritise those over the protection, needs and rights of children. With that being the case, we as an organisation, along with a range of organisations that we work with, partner with and consult with, are similarly minded that it is intentional, and that intention is manifest in how children are seen, treated as children and indeed young adults. And this can manifest itself in many ways. The detention of children, the questioning of their age, which leads to detention and return to places of exploitation. The short-term reception arrangements with a view to pushing for the return of these children once they reach the age of majority, and indeed in some member states before they reach the age of majority, which is 18. That being the case, where children are returned within that framework, they are in all probability returned to places of exploitation. So culpable in terms of member states. When I mention conflict between legislation, I cannot see, as an individual, certainly as an organisation, any circumstances in which you would put children at risk in this context, or indeed any context. And the conventions that we have as individual states and groups of states ratified are there for that reason. So the non-compliance with those particular conventions have a immensely damaging and detrimental impact on the lives of children. And what I've expressed so far is really policy terms and policy language and conventions, and quite high level in terms of system and systematic responses at state level having an impact. But what I'd like to say at this point is, when we talk about this, these mechanisms and systems have an immediate impact on the lives of these children, and indeed long-lasting impacts where safety has not been provided, where treatment has been impactful on a child and young adult's mental health, from a whole range of different directions, all designed to perpetuate and prioritise the need to keep migration down. And I would pose at this point that there are no circumstances that would enable or facilitate any child to be put in that position, and the conventions that I referred to earlier on are there to ensure that that is not the case. So the case we put to the tribunal will reflect these particular concerns, and these concerns directly related to children, young people, and indeed young adults, 18 years and above. And I think it's important to emphasise this, that children are children as defined by the convention. However, the commitment that we give to these children as children, certainly reflected within the child protective and looked after framework within the UK, for example, where children are cared for and their future planned with them and for them for a safe future as young adults and into full adulthood, is crucial. As it currently stands, that refusal to put the needs of children and young people first as a priority in all instances, as is reflected within the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is immensely damaging, not only to those individual children, but to our values as states that purport to care for children, hence the creation of the conventions. To do no harm and to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected as reflected in the human rights Convention. Now, as an organisation, we have taken a clear stand, and we would like, and indeed will, put forward some recommendations in regard to how children are seen, treated by member states, by union of member states, by individuals, by departments, by ministries, by governments. And what we would propose is that there is responsibility and culpability in terms of the complicity in ensuring that the rights of these children are removed. And we have three clear recommendations. First relates specifically to children being seen as children first, their needs recognised first as children and foremost, and their rights and needs afforded them as a priority above all else. The second relates specifically to young people who transition the age of majority into young adulthood, and their rights and needs afforded them as a priority above all else. Complicity and culpability. Our third demand will focus specifically at holding those individuals, policymakers, departments, ministries, governments, union of governments to account for those actions that directly impact the rights of children and indeed harm those children. And where that is the case, the full weight of the law as defined within the humanitarian protection be brought to bear on these individuals. Across the spectrum, they must be held to account. I will conclude by saying, as it appears when you look across Europe and indeed the world, how human rights are sidelined, undermined, ignored, denigrated, we should be hugely concerned, because these rights are afforded to all as human beings, afforded to all children. They are immensely important. And those who are minded, for whatever reason, to dismantle or disregard those or to break those should be held accountable. Thank you for listening. My name is Ishola of Love 146 UK. We wish you well.